The Dungeon of Black Company is an isekai anime with a surprisingly complex plot, and if I were to fully do a synopsis on the entire thing and get into all of the details about all of the plot points, this episode would be like 30 minutes long. So I'm going to sort of give you a Cliff Notes version and only talk about relevant, quickly accessible parts of it. Basically, there's this dude named Ninomiya who lived on Earth and managed to make a large fortune, essentially so that he could just never work another day in his life. He gets surprised isekai'd by a sort of space-time portal that takes him to another world, where he basically has to start over. Now, this world has recently discovered sort of a parallel to Japan's ultra-capitalistic dystopian work culture. And he ends up being forced into this sort of mine as a fantasy worker, acquiring basically magical ores for the company. And in doing so, and while trying to make his way through this world, he also ended up in a large amount of debt to a loan shark. Now, he's the sort of guy who will try and make the best of a bad situation, and he is also the sort of person who is not afraid of sort of turning the enemy's own tactics against them and using shady, manipulative tactics to get what he wants. So when he ends up finding a back door to a deeper part of the dungeon, and every subsequent floor of the dungeon pays better that you go into, he ends up forming an accord with basically the most powerful monster in the entire dungeon to basically not eat him, and he will in exchange provide her with food as long as she continues to protect him from the monsters in the actual dungeon. He then uses this to create several other working deals with other groups of monsters, most notably an entire ant colony. And so he uses this to try and seize control of the dungeon while also being pulled back by the sort of evil machinations of the company that owns the dungeon itself, and of course the loan shark that he owes literally millions of gold to. In the early part of the show, the main character ends up just making some progress, and then he gets dragged all the way back into more debt. And that is the part of the show that made me the absolute worst. And that was the part where I was like, oh, okay, this is going to be a sort of gag story about a guy who tries to make his best in the world and then constantly falls back. Now, he's not the best guy. At one point, he uses a mind control staff to force all of his coworkers to almost work themselves to death. But also shockingly, when he starts running actual corporations, he gives surprisingly fair and equitable work deals to his employees. So he's not a bad guy, but he's not necessarily a good guy. He is very morally gray. I would probably say that the mind control staff incident is the worst he ever is. And from that point on, he actually slowly lightens as he goes on and becomes a better person. But, shockingly enough, I thought the show was going to be a complete crapshoot once he tumbled back to where he started in episode 1. And if the show is about a character who constantly tries and then fails, or even he tries, is a shitty person and then fails, that's fucking repetitive, that's boring, that sucks. And yet, it really only happens that one time. After episode 1, everything else, even if he has setbacks, and he has a lot of setbacks, manages to actually progress the plot forward and actually manages to progress the main character's goals. And more to that point, as the main character starts bringing in other characters into his party and into his schemes and into his corporation, which he decides to call the Black Company, which is both a reference, of course, to the Japanese term black companies, which are companies you really, really don't want to work at because they'll kill you, but also a reference to being in the black and making money. You get it? It's a double entendre. You start to see that the show is not afraid of exploring and developing the characters. Even the characters that seem like they would be the absolute flattest, like the demon that he just makes an agreement with to not eat him, ends up getting a development. Even the ant colony ends up getting developed. And as Black Company goes, especially towards you get to the end, it has so many chances to fuck up the whole story, to the point where it feels like, for most of the anime, the entire thing is balanced on the edge of a knife. It was always one step away from greatness and one step away from being a complete dumpster pile. And yet, somehow, at every opportunity it has to completely fuck up all of the goodwill it managed to own, it managed to dodge those chances and managed to be a consistently good show throughout the entire runtime. There are a lot of plot twists in this and a lot of different changes to the dynamics of the show. It is not content to just settle with one guy starts company inside of a dungeon. Without getting into too many details, it sort of ends up going into sort of thematic parallels and metaphors for environmentalism, the evils of capitalism, the benefits of capitalism, which is surprisingly enough. And also at one point, the main character time travels and then switches sides, even though he was viewed as the messiah for the humans, and joins the demon side. He is a character with a lot of charisma who basically runs under the philosophy that sometimes you have to work just so you can stop working, because working sucks and I don't know why you would want to do that. And as a character, I kind of love him. And I ended up liking basically the entire cast because, again, they actually bother to explore them. They actually bother to develop them. They give them their own arcs. Even the characters that don't seem like they would get arcs end up having arcs. Like, the difference where the main antagonist, who probably has 5 minutes of screen time, is from when she is first shown to when she's shown at the end is kind of fucking crazy. For a show that is always teetering on the precipice of disaster, somehow they manage to flip just off the correct side of the knife and end up in actual greatness. And by greatness, I mean it's like an 8 rounded up. Twitch and Discord in the description. I've been Sacrobolic, your envoy of hope. Bye-bye.